again, and welcome back to our mini-series on playing the acoustic guitar in worship. If you have not checked out the previous videos, I'd love to encourage you to do that before watching this one, because we're building from video to video. In this one, we're going to be looking at strumming and picking. I'm going to talk you through some of the principles of strumming and hopefully give you some helpful pointers and examples. And in the second part of the video, we'll be looking at picking, whether that be using a plectrum or using your fingers, and how you can develop that particular skill and how it will aid you in developing your acoustic guitar playing. Now, strumming is something that I have found quite tricky in my progression as an acoustic guitarist. It's quite tempting, and I've often been tempted to think, I've got the chords down, the job is done. But strumming is just as important. I'm not going to give you a full rundown here of every different strumming pattern available to you, but I encourage you to spend some time learning more. Push yourself out of your comfort zone. If you've got a go-to strumming pattern, why not look for a couple more? Have a look on YouTube or on our Worship Tree resources to look at other examples of videos and articles to stretch your playing. Now, as you'll know, strumming is essentially the combination and timing of those up and down movements. And thinking about it in terms of up and down is often really helpful when it comes to acoustic guitar playing. Try to become aware of how you move your strumming hand and practicing those up and down movements. And that's particularly helpful if you struggle with timing. It can be tempting if you're playing slower paced songs or if you're at a point where you're not really doing steady strumming. Say, for example, if we're trying to let a chord ring out, it can be tempting just to do that and stop. If you struggle with timing, keeping that up and down movement going along with the click without touching the strings each time can be a really helpful way to keep your rhythm and timing. So, for example, that can be a really good way to stay in time. Now, even if you're just strumming once a bar, keeping that up and down can be a good way of doing it. Another thing to be aware of is the different speeds of strumming relative to the speed of the song. So what I mean by that is, if we've got a 4/4 song, you could strum once a bar, so that would be 1, 2, 3, 4, 2, 2, 3, 4. Or you could strum twice a bar. 1, 2, 3, 4. 1, 2, 3, 4. Or you could even do 4 times a bar. 1, 2, 3, 4. 1, 2, 3, 4. Or 8s. 1, 2, 3, 4. 1, 2, 3, 4. And depending on the BPM, and I'm not going to demonstrate it to you now, you might even be able to do 16ths, but unlikely. Now, your strumming is essentially a combination of those. It seemed quite robotic when I did kind of the 1, 2, 3, 4, but variation will come once you start practicing that bass line. And interchanging those can be a real helpful way to develop your strumming. Now, if this is early on in your acoustic guitar journey, or actually even if it's not, if, for example, you're looking at a new song you've not played before, you might find it easier to work out what to strum by listening to a recorded version of the song. And then, before you start thinking about chord shapes, just strum along with your right hand to work out where and when you might hit those strings, okay? So just sit there in your room, listening to the song, practicing the strumming pattern. It can be a really helpful technique for us as acoustic guitarists to separate out the different hands and practice each one separately. Again, it's helpful to do this with a metronome or click, either from an app or from YouTube, which will give you an idea of tempo. Start the tempo slow on the metronome, and then check you can strum correctly at a slower speed, and then gradually, as you're able to do it competently, bring it up to a higher speed. So, for example, the Passion song, Glorious Day, has an acoustic intro. If you're learning the strumming pattern, okay, if you're learning the song, listen to it on YouTube, get an idea of what is being played out. You can actually see on some of the videos, particularly acoustic guitar tutorials, you can see the hand strumming pattern. And then I would slow it down. I check out the BPM on the chord sheets, and then I would play it at maybe a half speed as a rule of thumb, and then gradually increase that BPM as you become more confident and competent in strumming that part. It will take some time, but particularly for trickier songs, it is worth investing that time before you get to rehearsal. Try to keep your strumming as regular as possible. Again, something that I personally sometimes struggle with. What I mean by that is if you select a strumming pattern for the verse of the song, try to stick to it within that verse. When it comes to other parts of the song, like the chorus for example, you might change it up slightly, and that could be a good thing to do. You can add variation to the sound of the band doing this. But a helpful way to work out what you should strum is to think about the band as a whole. In particular, think about the drums. Okay, if I was doing a bass video, I'd be going on at you about locking in with the drums. Actually, for acoustic guitarists, that is a similarly helpful thing to do. You want to generally match up to the drum beat. You definitely don't want to be playing against it. So listen out in particular for the kick, okay, which is that low floor drum, and think about the snare as well. Those are the two in particular to watch out for. This is helpful in particular when you think about variations in strumming. Places where you might want to vary are often builds. Now, builds are often found in the last bars of the verse going into the chorus, or maybe out of a bridge into a chorus. You, at that point, can switch from your usual verse pattern into a kind of straighter pattern. Okay, so imagine we're doing a verse of a song and we're kind of doing a fairly straightforward pattern. And then we might switch into a straighter 1, 2, 3, 4, 1, 2, 3, 4, 1, 2, 3, 4, 1, and gradually building it up into the chorus. Now, those builds shouldn't just be you doing your build and the bassist doing his build and everyone bringing a build. It should be a united build with the rest of the band. If you're the worship leader, which you might be as an acoustic guitarist, it's your job to make sure that those builds work together. If you're not the worship leader and you're not sure, check in as a band and agree how that build is going to work. Because it's important that we all lock in together to create that united sound. One thing to be aware of is the difference between strumming in time signatures. Now, most worship songs are 4/4. If you look at the top of your chord sheet, as well as the BPM that we've talked about and the title of the song and the key, there should also be a time signature. Okay, most are 4/4, but you do get a fair few in 3/4 or 6/8. You will need to adjust your strumming accordingly. You will need to ensure that your pattern fits with the time signature. Again, check out the further resources that will help you do this and develop appropriate strumming patterns for different time signatures. Another way then to develop further is to think about emphasis. There's certain songs or certain parts of songs where you might want to vary it. Usually, you put the hardest hit on the 1. I'm going to slightly exaggerate this bit, okay? But you're generally going 1, 2, 3, 4. 1, 2, 3, 4. Now, you obviously won't do it quite that heavy. But sometimes the emphasis might switch slightly. It might be on a different beat of the bar, okay? So it might be on a chorus or a bridge, or it might be through most of the song. So, for example, it might be on this 2. Okay, so we've got 1, 2, 3, 4. 1, 2, 3, 4. Again, to identify that, you should go to the recording. Okay, that's your guide. And then in rehearsal, again, it's about locking in with the drummer and the rest of the band and making sure the whole band replicates that emphasis. In this final part of the video, I want to move on from strumming to think about picking. This is a really great way to add a bit of colour and variation to your playing. You may find in particular that picking is useful later on in the worship set, so in times of encounter and response. You may find that a particular part of the song may lend itself to picking. So the intro, if it's kind of a lower intro, or the space left after the song where there's some spontaneous singing out. I challenge you to try to develop both picking with a pick and using your fingers, and try and practice them at home. As with the strumming, I'd recommend you look up other resources as well to help you do this. Look for examples. So starting with plectrum picking, I'd recommend you develop a couple of picking patterns and then practice them. Once you're confident and you know the pattern, play it at the slower speed, bring in that metronome and ramp up the BPM. Okay, so pick a pattern, maybe start at a slower kind of 60 BPM and then gradually increase it. See what tempos you can play them at. Generally with picking, you'll want to start on the root of the chord. Okay, so going back to G, okay, we'll be starting on that G, which is the E string, 3rd fret at the bottom, okay, and then work your way around. Maybe if you're new to this, start off with a 3-string pattern, okay? When it comes to picking, it can be quite helpful to use that more open G shape that we discussed in the previous video. So that will enable you to focus more on the quality and consistency of your picking and worry less about the left hand. So remember, that's that B and E there. And so on. Finally then, if we put our plectrum away for a minute and think about finger picking. Now, arguably this is a bit trickier, but ultimately I really like this. This is a really flexible way of playing. I started off playing bass rather than guitar, so kind of I naturally gravitated to this and I found plectrum playing trickier. But wherever you're at, I'd encourage you to explore this because it gives you so many options, okay? Again, for example, it's easier to play multiple notes at once because you can pluck them. They don't even have to be aligned with each other. They don't have to be next to each other. If you normally gravitate to plectrum picking, look to start using your thumb and maybe one other finger or two. Okay, so again, that pattern we were talking about before, the 3-string pattern, try and do it with your finger and your thumb. Generally, you'll again want to play the lower note with your thumb, okay? That's partly just practically because of where the position of your hand is relative to the string, but also your thumb is generally stronger and bigger and it will give a natural prominence to the root and you'll kind of be a bit louder with that. And then beyond that, there's a whole array of different things you can use. Eventually, you might get up to the point where you can use all 5 fingers. Be aware that generally, particularly at the first, your 4th and 5th finger will result in quieter sounds because they will not be as strong and well practiced in that particular use. A few pointers on this, okay, when we're playing in worship. We will need to be aware of transitions throughout the set and throughout all the songs, but actually, in particular, transitioning between using a plectrum to strum and then maybe finger picking. Work out how you're going to hold your plectrum while you finger pick, okay? So you've got it here. Some people kind of hold it in their hands there. Some people actually just kind of put it down at that point. I know some people who've got little holders on guitars or they've got something on their strap that they can put plectrums in. Always have a few spares because you are liable to drop them, okay? Maybe in your back pocket or you can get the microphone wedges that you can stick them in as well. Okay, so be aware that you might drop them when you're transitioning, but practice that transition, okay? And think about when you're going to switch, okay? Don't rock up to rehearsal and be like, I'm strumming, and then I might pick somewhere. Work out where you are going to pick beforehand. And then once you're kind of comfortable with that, you can then think to add in a bit more variation. You can start exploring things like kind of hammer-ons and hammer-offs. And lots of other things that you can bring in once you feel more confident with the basics. With both finger and plectrum picking, it's also an opportunity to try out different chord shapes and inversions, so you might find yourself moving up the neck more than you would when you're strumming. So for example, if we're playing in G, you might look for different patterns that you can move up. So for example, there's quite a nice one that you can do using just 3 strings. okay? And you can then move that shape around the neck. And it's slightly different when it comes to the minor. But again, there's lots of patterns like that you can research and use that generally are slightly less useful for strumming, but then could be a real nice way to add variation when it comes to plectrum or finger picking. There's loads more that I could talk about with this, with strumming and picking. So if you're interested in going further, please do look up additional resources. But in this video, we've looked at strumming, we've looked at how to do it well, discussed how finger picking and plectrum picking can be a really great way to add variation to your playing. And then next time, we're going to discuss how to play in a band where they've not just got one, but they've got two acoustic guitars, and how we as acoustic guitars can settle into that rhythm and work well together. So thank you so much for watching, and I'll see you next time.